FY20, and we'll be still paying invoices on that project, certainly into FY21, but potentially into FY22, although probably not likely.
Question, I guess, for the auditors. As long as you know kind of where the money is coming from an accounting perspective, I assume that's fine, even if you're not spending from the current fiscal year. Is that?
Oh, yeah, and that's how, I mean, if you're issuing debt, right, and these capital projects are going to take multiple years. So that's
and my last one is more of a comment, so more of a PSA for everybody. So on page 159 to 160, I always find this really helpful in the CAFR, which is essentially what I call city by the numbers. So it calls out, for example, how many news releases did we do? How many calls for service did we have in the city? How many DWI arrests we had? How many library books were checked out? So I always think that's a really helpful kind of indicator of activity in the city. So more of a PSA for my colleagues.
Mr. Lichtenhouse.
Thank you. So in the short form version, the letter that you wrote to us about internal controls, there was a comment on page 5 related to change orders, which is an issue that we ran into related to the City Hall construction. We've asked a lot of questions about lessons learned as it would apply to the library project. So in terms of some of the things that you guys have called out for internal controls in the internal audit that you did, is there are there action items to help resolve that, things that we get feedback on, or is this just calling things out and it's up to the city to put plans and processes in place to make sure we put the appropriate controls in there?
I think the city has the appropriate policies in place, and it's just a matter of under time crunches and stressful situations that those policies are followed. So I think, and this was very openly discussed with us. It's not something that we as auditors found, right? Mm-hmm. It was as soon as we walked in the door, it was like, hey, you're going to find this, and we want you to know.
Yeah, I guess let me rephrase that. I didn't think it was kind of an aha moment. We've talked about
right, yeah. It's
nothing that was unearthed. I was more curious as to resolution, if there are processes, if there are guidelines that we could review to effectively deal with that, call it a roadmap that would help us to learn from that, things that we can follow to improve the processes themselves. Or is this just literally calling it out without you guys providing that roadmap from kind of an independent perspective?
Well, to that, I would say, the city has a procurement policy, right? So I feel like that's the roadmap to follow, right? But beyond that, I don't have further recommendations. I mean, we could sit down and talk further about it, but I don't want to say that there's a one way to do it.
Okay. A comment I would make on it, and we will be given council lessons learned document at your next meeting, and we'll probably have a deeper discussion of it at your 6th meeting. But it really came down to the City Hall project and the completeness of the plans when the project started. And so the lesson learned is that the library plans have been before us now with adequate time for staff to review them, to make sure we're comfortable with every detail, from the data drops to where the outlets are. The big thing we didn't have that same level of plan review for the City Hall project. So when the contractor is rolling, this is the sort of the pressure of the time crunch. The project manager is approving changes in the field in order to keep the project moving. So if we cause delays, that makes the project more expensive. And that's the pressure, and the solution to it is
Mr. Snyder?
Thanks much. Just following up on page 5 on the shorter document, there's a point made regarding the schools and a point made regarding the city. And while I understood the city manager a minute ago to talk about lessons learned, it talks about here in internal controls about approving change orders. So my question is, what internal controls will you put in place regarding approval of change orders in the future? And then I would ask the same thing about the schools to address the comment made to them. Thank you.
I think what we would need to do is there's a couple steps with it. One, for the change orders themselves, they do have multiple eyes on them, and so there are segregation of duties and controls for those. We had very little contingency for the City Hall project, so the other step, which is another breakdown in our process, is coming back to council to get an authorization for the change orders. And that's where the time crunch, the time pressure came into play, because that can be a month-long process. So what we will do, I think going forward for the library project, we'll have a contingency, so that ideally we won't need to come back to council for a contract amendment, but we will keep a regular log of those and keep the council informed of the change orders as they're coming along, just for transparency's sake. I think that's the other improvement we need to make vis-a-vis the City Hall project relative to the library.
With respect to the comment on page 5 about the approval of payroll and segregation of duties, it is something, as the auditor indicated, thank you very much, being a small shop, we do have some cross-functioning. We've added the chief operating officer's signature as an additional piece. We've been following the payroll and the separation of duties, but we haven't actually signed off on those. So the additional step that we're going to be taking is signing off on those.
All right, Mr. Duncan, Vice Mayor Cohen.
This may be more a question about the budget than about the audit, but since the letter at the beginning is included in lowercase Roman numeral 5 page, the reference to the net fiscal impact of several of the more recent mixed-use projects is a 2017 number. Does that reflect the fact that we've just not yet updated the fiscal impact model beyond 2017, and are we thinking about getting that updated next year?
We are updating it this year, and so that is an old number.
Okay, so the number is quite likely higher than 1.7 million, certainly not less.
Yeah.
Okay. The only other question I have, and this, I'm not sure who this really applies to, but when I first started here, got this the first time, obviously it was mostly new to me. And, and I remember when Ms. Connolly came on, we spent a fair amount of time trying to understand where various buckets of money were and how they were accounted for. And then council joined together all of us and aligned the tax year with the budget year so that we would not end up in the position of those being offset in a way that annually yielded a number that was typically a surplus, about the time of year when those numbers came clear. So we have aligned the budget and the tax year now. Is there anything that we should do, can do? We're still ending up with pretty good numbers in terms of surpluses, and that's obviously a good thing, but there may be years where that's not such a good number, and those are going to be very unpleasant years, I think, as we've gotten used to good times. In terms of an audit being able to help us, predict or manage ourselves, I think we've, fair to say, managed pretty conservatively, and that's why our numbers look good. But at the same time, the numbers might not always look good, and there is still a challenge in communicating to the public about why we why we discuss over, $300,000-$400,000 in the budget, and then 6 months later we end up $2.3 million to the good. Is there anything that we can, should, might do to narrow that gap?
So specifically to revenue forecasts, actual to budget.
Mm-hmm.
So the biggest step we did is, which you referenced, is aligning the tax year and the fiscal year for property tax. That was our biggest variable. Now about 30% of our revenues, local taxes, sales, meals, all those vascular taxes, which we'll talk about a lot later on tonight, that's really where your variance can occur now. and so it's much tighter than it used to be. Does that answer your question, or and can we get it tighter still? That's what we always endeavor to do.
You know, I think you're doing probably the best that can humanly be done, but it is still a messaging challenge to explain to people, you know, and I'm not sure we've kind of quite gotten on top of that, you know. I think we're getting there, you know. I think the school board and the council are getting to the point where if we do have money that, call it what you will, you know, surplus or underspending or whatever, you know, we have a way to deal with that. That's different from how it was done when I first started, and that's good. But we still, I think, have a challenge in communicating with the public.
When we have surpluses.
Yeah.
If I may add to that, Councilmember Duncan, is that in the last year or two, we have seen special spike, primarily because of the construction activity, the permit fees that's related to it, and also the investment income on earnings on our investment income that has been, so those are kind of things we've kept in mind, and we are going to align the next year's budget with that. However, those are more of the one-time nature that are not that easy to predict and kind of go along as we go. But our tax revenues are more or less along the budgeted amounts. We have, of course, bypassed that even on the tax revenues, but not by that much. It's the other revenues that kind of gave the boost to the surplus, the one-time surplus last year.
Okay, I think that's a good start on trying to explain to folks. Somebody the other day, you know, online, I said something about an expense that we, you know, probably want to discuss trying to bear, and I said we'll have to find money for that. And they said, well, where do you find the money? And partly the answer is what you just said. You know, investments have done better than anybody ever expected, and permit fees, those are a little different. Those are supposed to be in a lockbox, you know, kind of to pay for the people who are doing the inspections. But just, you know, let's always be thoughtful about how to explain why we end up to the good, because someday we're going to have to explain why we're not ending up to the good, and it'll be more credible, I think, if we sort of laid the foundation in good times. Thanks.
All right, before we get to Vice Mayor Connolly, the two newest elected folks from the school board have just joined us. I don't know if you can see them. Ms. Gill, would you like them to join us at the table? We'll find somewhere.
I don't know, but we want to be as good as possible. If you'd like to join us. Yeah.
And they're still here, so that's good news. All right, Vice Mayor Connolly. All right, that's all we've got. Is there anything additional on your end? All right, thank you for your audit, your fine work, and for the report you've prepared. Look forward to seeing you again soon. All right, so now off to budget presentations. Is that right, Mr. Shields?
That is right. And so we'll start with Ms. Bawa will provide a revenue forecast, and sort of following up on Mr. Duncan's comments, we do go into some detail in some of the key local tax revenues, comparing budget to actual over prior years. And the goal of that is just to be transparent about our revenue forecast. Revenue forecasts matter a whole lot, and we want to be open book about it. And we go into much more detail when we do them, but this is sort of a good high-level view of the data that we look at. We want everybody to see it. I'll speak a little bit about some of the budget drivers and the schedule, and then we'll turn it over to Dr. Noonan to talk and there's a school presentation, and we'll get all that information out there, and then have a discussion and feedback.
Good evening, members of the council and school board members. We have for you, in preparation of the fiscal year 21 budget development, today we'll review the preliminary revenue projections, the budget cost drivers on the city side and the school side, along with the capital funding plan update that we have issuance, the bond issuance, and finally the budget calendar at the end. So a closer look at the national and regional economy, what it's telling us now. According to the Federal Reserve Chairman, the overall U.S. economy is growing at a moderate rate, and we expect to see more of the same, is what he has stated. I'd like to say that the U.S. economy is in its 11th year of expansion, the longest record that has been supported by rising incomes and solid